Good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody here today. This is Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon, lesson 12. We're just about done. For those of you who are ready for a change, I'm just about done. So, but I really enjoyed teaching this class. So before we start, let's go ahead and have a prayer. Father God, we love you so much, and we thank you for your presence in our lives. We know without you, our lives would be without so much rich meaning, and we thank you for that. We thank you for the meaning that we find in your word as we study it. Help us to dig deep into your word, learn more new things, and help that enrich our lives and be more like your Son, Christ. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. I'd like to say that I like all my lessons equally, but that wouldn't be exactly true. I worked all these lessons together, and last week's I didn't pay as much attention to because I was so excited about this week. This week is kind of interesting because I learned something new that I hadn't learned before. So we're going to go over that today. We're going to do a little bit of a review, and then next week I have a little bit of a surprise for you next week. Next week, normally, back in the old days when I taught fourth grade, one of my favorite things to do was to do the review at the end of the section. And another thing that you've missed out on being as adults is my wife used to make cookies, and that was part of the thing. So next week, we have reviews. If you finish the review, you can have a cookie with your name on it, okay? So you've been good. I just thought, well, let's just have a little bit of fun with it. And because to me, studying the Bible is hard, but it should be fun. There should be a delight in it because that's what I find when I study is I find something delightful, something really neat. And that's what I'm trying to find today. So today we'll talk about a lot of different things. So don't miss next week or no cookies. All right, today's lesson seems really cheerful, right? Suffering, strife, and reconciliation. But we're towards the end of David's career as a king, towards the end of his life, and we're going to talk about the things that happened during that time. Last week we had just sort of a straightforward let's read the Bible lesson. We talked about Absalom's conspiracy, which was he was going to take over. David flees Jerusalem. David and Ziba, Ziba is Mephibosheth's guardian. I might just drop that story. You can always read this. Shimei curses David. Absalom enters Jerusalem. Hushai saves David, and then Absalom is killed. I kind of left it last week right after Absalom was killed. And that was sort of intentional because what happens after when Absalom is killed is kind of important for this week. So let's look at that. Our first rogue is Absalom that we talked about. So let's get into the story, shall we? It was told Joab, "Behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom." So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people, for the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters, the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For today you made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now therefore rise, go out, and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now." Then the king arose took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, "Behold, the king is sitting in the gate," and the people came before the king. This story always kind of bothered me a lot because I thought, well, hey, Absalom's David's son. David didn't want his son killed. So his reaction is natural. Well, Joab, you're just being too hard on David. He's naturally going to be upset because his son has died. But the truth of the matter is, Joab has a point here in the sense that when he's king, you have to put his kingdom first. When you read in the verse, it says, people were coming back to Jerusalem like they were ashamed because David was crying and they had just won a victory, but David was so upset about it. So part of the obligation that comes from being a king means that you have to put personal considerations aside and put on that face. The face that's the king, the face that's happy for the nation. Because if you grieve, that the son was killed, you grieve that the person that led the rebellion was killed, and all these people are putting their lives on the line for you, that's not going to go well. In fact, really, there's a kind of a huge impact that this particular moment in time has on David's history, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. Let me get a swig, and we'll go right on. So, whose king is David anyway? Now, what I've done in this part of the lesson is I've kind of edited out some miscellany, but kind of to make the real story clear here. Now, Israel had fled every man to his own home, and all the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies and saved us from the hand of the Philistines. And now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now, therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" Now, a lot of times we get a little bit confused when we're reading the Old Testament because we always think of Israel as one country. But it's really not looked at as one country for hardly at all. Pretty much we're going to have a divided kingdom shortly after this. Really the only time it was one country was sort of under Solomon. And then when you said Israel, you're talking about everybody in Israel, including Judah. But here we're talking about Israel excluding Judah. So we're talking about the other 10 tribes. I think this is very sweet. The 10 tribes of Israel are longing to bring David back to Jerusalem. But here's what happens. And he swayed, he being David, the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, "Return, both you and all your servants." So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and bring the king over the Jordan. So, who wanted to bring the king back? Israel. Who did David want to bring him back? Judah. Now you ask, why? And so does Israel. Israel's going, what's going on? Then and this is kind of, I don't know, this is obviously shorthand because it'd be funny if all the men of Israel actually did this. They surely had a spokesman. But then all the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, "Why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household over the Jordan and all David's men with him?" But Judah's the one that replies, interestingly enough, "All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. Why then are you angry over the matter? Have we eaten at all at the king's expense, or has he given us any gift?" David wanted his family and his clan to bring him back because that's who he was close to. But Israel, at that time, if he had embraced Israel, perhaps, instead of just embracing his own family, things would have turned out differently. But he said, "Hey, it's my family that I really love. Israel, sure, you're my country. It's my family that I really love." But do you think Judah's just going to say, hey, that's cool? And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, we have 10 shares in the king, and in David we have more than you. Why then do you despise us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? But the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. When they say 10 shares, is obviously we're talking about 10 tribes. So technically they do have 10 shares, right? And we have more than you. We have a higher population than Judah. But in the end, the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So who won the debate? Judah won the debate. Now there happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. And he blew the trumpet and said, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tent, O Israel. So all the men of Israel withdrew from David and followed Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah followed their king steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. All right. So revolution number 2 that we're going to talk about today, tribe of Benjamin striking back because they were sort of insulted in the sense that they wanted to bring David back to Israel, but David wanted his family to bring him back. Then the king said to Amasa, call the men of Judah together to me within 3 days, and be here yourself. So Amasa went to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time that had been appointed him. And David said to Abishai, now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do to us more harm than Absalom. Take your Lord's servants and pursue him, lest he get himself fortified cities and escape from us. So the issue here, Amasa is supposed to be there in 3 days. He doesn't quite make the 3-day cutoff. 3 days is a pretty short period of time, but Bichri's already on the run. We need to make sure we have a full army chasing after him. And there went out after him Joab's men. Why? Because he called Abishai, and Abishai and Joab are brothers, and Abishai is going to lead Joab's men. When they're at the great stone that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath, fastened on his thigh. And he went forward. As he went forward, it fell out. And Joab said to Amasa, is it well with you, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. But Amasa did not observe the sword that was in Joab's hand. So Joab struck him with it in the stomach. Omit a lot of gory details. And he died. Okay. Whenever almost 9 times out of 10 in the Old Testament, when they talk about somebody putting a sword on their thigh, it's like that's a concealing method. They hide it under their cloak there, or her robe, tunic. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued Sheba, the son of Bichri. And one of Joab's young men took the stand by Amasa and says, whoever favors Joab and whoever is for David, let him follow Joab. So Amasa, for those of you who can't remember, these two are cousins. Joab is a son of Zeruiah, David's sister. Amasa is a son of Abigail, David's sister. But now he has no nephews from Abigail because Amasa is dead. And just 2 nephews from Zeruiah, Joab and Abishai. And the town we're talking about here is Abel Beth-Maachah. We hardly ever in the Old Testament get a chance to go up above the Sea of Galilee very far. But this is Abel Beth-Maachah, which is pretty far up. And Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel of Beth-Maachah. And all the Bichrites assembled and followed him in. And all the men who were with Joab came and besieged him and Abel of Beth-Maachah. And they cast up a mound against the city, and it stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall to throw it down. Then a wise woman called from the city, listen, tell Joab, come here that I may speak to you. It's an interesting study as far as how they were attacking the city. They were actually going to knock the wall down and built up a big earthen rampart. And if they had knocked the wall down, that would have been really destructive for the city. I am one of those who is peaceful and faithful in Israel. You seek to destroy a city that is mother in Israel. Why will you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? Joab answered, far be it from me, far be it that I should swallow up or destroy. That is not true. But a man of the hill country of Ephraim called Sheba, the son of Bichri, has lifted up his hand against King David. Give him up alone, and I will withdraw from the city. And the woman said to Joab, behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall. So, simple solution. They did it. That's the end of that story. Okay. So, Absalom done, Sheba done. Now we're going to talk about the Gibeonites. Now, I may have actually even said in this class, one of the things that's kind of unusual, we have a lot of towns that have the same kind of name. Here you have Gibeon, who we're going to talk about today. Gibeah is Saul's hometown, and up here you have Geba. All three of those are three distinct towns. Now, if you ever hear the word Gibeath with a TH, that's a construction. Gibeath means hill. So whenever they say, they use that several times in the Bible. They'll say Gibeath, and that means hill. But Gibeah is the town of Saul. Gibeon is a town we're going to talk about today. But notice we've also got Ramah and Nob, two others, and Jerusalem. Three other towns. All right. So let's turn back in our Bibles to Joshua chapter 9, verses 6 and then 12 through 15. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our house as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and these sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. Whenever you hear they did not ask counsel from the Lord, you know they made a mistake, right? And Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors, and they lived among them. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were, first one is Gibeon. And, Shapira, Beeroth, and Kiriath-Jearim. Kiriath-Jearim, we talked about earlier also. So it's kind of funny. I forgot that Kiriath-Jearim was on the list of this group. Now, if you read the first part of Joshua chapter 9, you learn that there's actually a group of local tribes that got together and started to see the way things were turning, because we'd already had several big battles, and Israelites were winning, Canaanites were losing. And the smart Canaanites got together and said, hey, let's have this little plan. Let's put on some old stuff and say we come from a far land, and let's just make a treaty with these guys, because there's no way they'll make a treaty with us if they know we're from here. So let's just pretend. Verse 18, but the people of Israel did not attack them, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the elders. But all the leaders said to the congregation, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This will do to them, let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath we swore to them. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know what happens in the end. They became woodcutters and water carriers. I don't know why they picked those jobs, but those are the jobs they picked. And they lived with them to that day. And it's one of the more interesting stories in the story of Joshua. I mean, it's kind of an interesting a little story right there, right after you get through a couple of big battles. But what does that have to do with today's lesson? Well, let's find out. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death. Just exactly what we're reading there. The Israelites used to be afraid to put the Gibeonites to death because they'd made a covenant with them. But this has been a long time. That was Joshua. We already gone through Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. So we've moved on. And Saul did not care for the Gibeonites. Verse 5, they said to their king, the man who consumed us, this is the Gibeonites talking, and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, lest 7 of his sons be given to us so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord. And the king says, I will give them. Verse 9, and he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hanged them on the mountain before the Lord, and the 7 of them perished together. They were put to death in the first days of the harvest at the beginning of barley harvest. I don't know what barley looks like, but that's what the internet says it looks like, but it could be wrong. Then Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it for herself on the rock from the beginning of harvest until the rain fell upon them from the heavens. And she did not allow the birds of the air to come upon them by day, or the beasts of the field by night. Rizpah, in case you don't know, that's Saul's concubine. Some of these children were from Rizpah. And David had made a pact with Jonathan not to kill his family. And the one person that really got the benefit of that was Mephibosheth, the child who was born or became lame on an exit of Gibeah, I believe. So Rizpah has put on a sad face and has done what she can to protect the dignity of her fallen sons. And this is David, verse 13. And he brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who were hanged. Now, for those of you who can't remember, the bones of Saul and the bones of his son were brought to Kiriath Jearim. Kiriath Jearim is the first city that Saul had success in, when Nahash the Ammonite threatened to put out the eye of these people. And then when Saul died, the men of Kiriath Jearim were so moved that they took his body back from the gruesome display that they had, the Philistines had set up, and buried it. But they buried it in Kiriath Jearim, not in the land of his fathers. So, and they buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin, in Zelah, the tomb of Kish his father, did all that the king commanded, and after that, God responded to the plea for the land. Now, this is a weird story, and does it add that much to it? Maybe not. But here's one of the reasons why I brought that in. And I'm gonna talk about this a little bit, because I just realized that if I include this story, I can talk about all the different ways God communicates through messages in the Old Testament, or at least in this book. And it's probably more or less most of the ways he communicates in any of the Old Testament books. And you see here also, I pull this out of Ephesians and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. That is definitely completely out of context, but I believe the phrase just means and try to discern what is pleasing to the Lord. It means probably in a more of a practical sense, like try to learn what it is to please the Lord by doing what the Lord wants you to do, okay? That's more of the context. But doesn't this also mean that we should try to learn what really makes God happy, what really makes God upset? I mean, part of the ways you can do that is look in the Old Testament where he's speaking directly. I mean, of course we can look at his commandments. That's great. But what makes him most upset? What makes him least upset? If you want to see what makes God most upset, read about Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He really gets upset at him. Anyway, David says this about it in Psalms 18, with the merciful, you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man, you show yourself blameless. With the purified man, you do purely. And with the crooked man, you make your seem tortuous. You save the humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. To me, that's a really good summary of how God treats people in the Old Testament. But when God sends a message, and it's a verbal message from one of his men of God, one of his prophets, what kind of behavior, it has a because clause, requires God to send a message? The message is behaviors have consequences. And what does God want in response? Okay, that's my three-part analysis tool. Sometimes only the first two are important, and sometimes the last one is really important. But we're going to talk about all the situations that I figured out. And if you have any questions about this, or you think I'm a little off base, let me know after we're done. But I like what I've got here. Specific judgments. God's judgments are usually determined by the offense. So look for similarities in the offense and what God does in response. After you find that, you'll find that God always gives it a twist. Now, I'm going to go with one that I've already covered 100,000 times, but just to make sure I drive my point home. David's message, his behavior, he killed Uriah with the sword of the Ammonites. The message is, the sword will not depart from your house. The response, David is penitent. Here we have a parallel with a twist. They both have swords involved, but one is you killed the guy with the sword, now the sword's going to stick with you. Now, what if you get no message at all? God's judgments are sometimes applied to future generations. And I guess the question is why? If God desires a specific response to his message, he makes sure it falls on willing ears. That's usually true. Say like Saul killing the Gibeonites. Did he give a message to Saul? No, none to Saul. Probably because he was unwilling to do what the Lord would have asked of him. And don't forget, the Lord had forsaken him. So Saul was in open rebellion at this point. So he didn't give a message to Saul. Now, this is all speculation, because how can we can make reference to something that God doesn't do? All we know is he didn't do it in the time of Saul. But I think that's accurate. And what about generalized judgments that are unrelated? Sometimes God's judgments don't really relate to the offense. In those cases, the people sometimes pray to find out. That's what just happened. In this case, you look at the similarities in David's response to the wrong that was committed. David's response was similar to a judgment God might have given Saul if he were not king at the time, or if it would have caused Saul to repent. So here you have Saul killed the Gibeonites. The message, Saul broke the covenant by killing Gibeonite sons, and the response is 3 years of famine. Well, what does famine have to do with anything? Famine certainly isn't related to killing people. But, I mean, does God send famine? Yes, he does. He also, sometimes he'll send the enemies to attack them. Sometimes he'll send pestilence. He sent all those things. Sometimes he'll send death. Those four things are unrelated, but just a general judgment. And so, in David's case, he was smart to pray to figure out what's going on. The response was 7 of Saul's sons killed, and then Saul's family was laid to rest. David just did that last part on his own, but I think it was part of what God wanted him to do, because David had a keen sense of understanding what God wanted. And what happened, the famine ended. So that's the end of that. I'll have one more at the end. But anyway, that's 3 ways to look at judgments. In the middle here, he throws in a song, David's song of deliverance in 2 Samuel 22. And the only verse you know of that by heart is verse 47, I believe, which has a nice little song to it. But I like verses 44 also. This isn't really a stanza, but I've kind of collapsed the stanza in that last verse. You delivered me from strife with my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People who I have not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners' lost heart came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be my God, the rock of my salvation. All right. And this is really where I got interested in this, is in 2 Samuel chapter 24, because this completely blew my mind. I had no idea what was going on. I think I have a better idea what's going on now. I prayed about it a lot. If somebody has a better idea, you feel free to tell me about this. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against him, saying, "Go, number Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army, who was with him, "Go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people." So why does David do it? He says, that I may know the number of the people. Well, to me, that's sort of restating what he asked him to do. But I'll show you what I think he means. But Joab said to the king, "May the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are. Well, the eyes of my lord the king still see it. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" That's when you question what's going on. When Joab thinks it's wrong, then it's probably really wrong. Joab says, "But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" Joab recognized the census for what it was, an attempt to find out exactly how strong Israel was as a nation. How many people did they have, and how many could join the army? That's the only thing that makes sense as far as this being a bad thing. And David, if he knew exactly how many people he had, he could brag, "Well, we have this many soldiers, this many here, this many there." And he could use that as a way to get out the message that Israel is a strong country. Now, that is most likely the reason that this census was a bad thing. But there are other possibilities. I mean, there's the first time they ever did a census, it was for this temple tax. And when they did the temple tax, everybody was supposed to give a half a shekel for their life. And that was the first census they had. So did that have anything to do with it? There's a lot of possibilities. But in honesty, when you go back to here, that I may know the number of my people, and you realize that Joab says, "But why does my Lord delight in this thing?" I think that's what it is. But David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people, and David said to the Lord, "I've sinned greatly in what I have done, but now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly." And when David arose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and say to David, thus saith the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, that I may do it to you." So Gad came to David and told him, said to him, "Saul, shall 3 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return with to him who sent me." Anybody want to get those 3 choices? Which one would you pick? Is there a good choice there? I don't like any of those choices. I would say, can we do something else? But that's the only choices he had. So David takes he does the same thing I probably would too. Then David said to Gad, "I'm in great distress. Let it fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great. But let me not fall into the hand of man." So David said, "I don't know, whatever you want." So the Lord sent a pestilence on Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. That's a huge number of men. When the angel stretched out his hand towards Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from his calamity and said to the angel who was working destruction among the people, "It's enough. Now stay your hand." And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Then David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking the people and said, "Behold, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly, but these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against my father's house." I love this part. If there's a good part in losing 70,000 people, it's the fact that David's heart was broken. And David said, "Hey, take it out against me. Don't take it against these sheep, these poor people of Israel. They had nothing to do with this. This was me. This was me." And you can just hear the pleading in his voice. And Gad came that day to David and said to him, "Go up, raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite." So David went up at Gad's word as the Lord commanded. And when Araunah looked down, he saw the king and his servants coming towards him. And Araunah went out and paid homage to the king with his face to the ground. You may remember, or you may not, Jebusites are the original inhabitants of Jerusalem. They're the ones that said that we can blind and lame people can keep this city safe because the walls are so good. But Araunah was one of the original inhabitants. And Araunah said, "Why has my lord the king come to his servant?" David said, "To buy the threshing floor from you, in order to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be averted from the people." Then Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer up what seems good to him. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering, and the threshing sledges, and the yokes of the oxen for the wood. All this, King Araunah gives to the king." And Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord your God accept you." Here's a great showing of faith, another great example of how everybody just seemed to love David, even the people that he conquered. They knew David was a good man. And Araunah saw David in distress. He said he was in great distress. I don't know what David looks like in great distress, but I'm pretty sure it shows on his face. I mean, he just stopped the hand of the angel of the Lord from setting pestilence in Jerusalem. I mean, he was just right there. He didn't stop it. It was God. But it was right there, seeing it all happen. I mean, that's got to be crazy. But this is the best part. This is the big quote. Take it home. But the king said to Araunah, "No, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord responded to the plea for land, and the plague was averted from Israel. Quick looking at this. Generalized judgments usually await a response. Why does God make a generalized judgment like famine, pestilence, sword? Because God wants a response. God's judgments can be efforts to elicit a specific response or a plea from one or more followers. In these cases, the judgments can be more generalized, but they may still have similarities. When God gets a response, he is after, the judgment will cease. So what happened here? David had a census. This is how I'm going to do the cause and effect, because it works for me. It may not work for you, but it works for me. Finally came up with something. Cause? You want a lot of people, David? Huh? You want a lot of people? You think you got a lot of people there? Well, you're going to have less people now. And that is the response. Because this was an affront to God. Now, why was this such a big affront to God? No good answer. But it was clearly a big affront to God. So this is all comes down to the part about learning what pleases the Lord. The Lord doesn't like his census. Why does he not like his census? Does it really matter? All we know is that he doesn't like it. These are the kind of things that you can learn through example, but it's not going to be written in "Thou shalt not have a census." So what happened? David had a penitent heart. David paid for and built an altar, and that was it. So once he paid for and built the altar, he heard the plea, and that was it. Now, we have exactly 5 minutes left. I know last week I ended early, but I always end late, so I figure I owed it to you. But this week we're going to end on time because I've got a big review. Now, we're just going to kind of go over it real quick. This is just sort of a generalized thing. We're going to cover all the David history real quick. Now, David had 3 anointings, in case you don't remember. His first anointing, he was age 15-ish. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. It was by Samuel, okay? Then he had 2 more anointings. I'll just not go back on that. But Hebron, he was anointed king over Judah by the men of Judah at age 30. Again in Hebron, he was also anointed king over Israel by the elders of Israel at 37. Now, we often think of that as being Jerusalem, but Jerusalem happened just right after that. Hebron was the capital for the first 7 years. All right, so we're going to talk about David's 5 stages of development. And I'm breaking these down into the places he lived. His origin story comes from Bethlehem. His royalty comes in Gibeah, fugitives, Adullam, exile, Ziklag, and king in Hebron and Jerusalem. Now, as I go through here, I'm going to give you some quotes, and it's going to be in chronological, so it's pretty easy. But I'm going to give you some quotes and see if you can tell me where they're from or in your head. Here's our first quote. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from this Philistine. Where was he there? You come to me with the sword and the spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you defiled. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves, not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. Answer his origin story. That's his origin story in Bethlehem. That happened from birth to 15 or so. His description is a man after God's own heart, of course, skillful in playing, man of valor, man of war, prudent in speech, man of good presence, and the Lord is with him. What kind of lifestyle did he have in the origin story? Well, he was tending the sheep. He was playing the lyre for Saul. He was commuting between Bethlehem and Gibeah quite a bit. That's an interesting thing. I've once lived as a commuter. That's not the easiest thing to do. And you remember, every time he came, pretty much, it doesn't say every single time, but he brought food with him every time. So he had like donkeys and stuff with cheese and grain, trying to cozy up to the rich folks. Major events. He was anointed. First thing, killed a lion, killed the bear, killed Goliath. Now, to me, the most important thing he learned that I can think of in his origin story is he learned to rely on God. He was just a poor farm boy, so he grew up without luxuries. He learned how to play the lyre, how to compose music. He was physically capable enough to fight wild animals. He had 6 or 7 brothers, almost fell down, that he didn't particularly like him, so he didn't like social development. Maybe he learned how to fight because he had 6 or 7 brothers. The reason I say 6 or 7 brothers is because in Samuel it says he had 7 brothers, and in Chronicles he says he is the 7th brother. So it's like there's some little niggly things in this story that bother me, but we can go over that later. And someone taught him about God and how to have faith in him. Who do you think it was? Was it Jesse or was it Mrs. Jesse? I don't know. I put faith in Mrs. Jesse. They're always the unsung heroes in the Old Testament is the mamas. Quotes, does it seem to you a little thing that the king's son-in-law, because I'm a poor man and have no reputation, who am I and who are my nephews? My father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king. What have I done? What is my guilt? And why is your sin before your father that he seeks my life? This is royals in Gibeah. We're going to go fast now. Late teens, early 20s. Saul would not let David return. He had success in all his undertakings. All Israel and Judah loved him. And Michal loved him. He played the lyre, commander of thousands, Saul's bodyguard, royal court. He received a robe, armor, and sword, made a covenant with Jonathan, married Michal, and dodged spears 3 times. So, what did he learn here? Court politics and military training. That's something he didn't have. Met his best friend, got married, learned how to lead people in the military, dealt with fame, understood social status and how his was changing, got used to luxury living, and learned how it felt to be hunted. That's the weirdest thing at the end of that. But he learned how it felt to be hunted, to have a spear thrown at you. See, my father, the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact I cut off the corner of your robe. Read the rest of that. Now, therefore, let not my blood fall the earth away from the presence of the Lord. That's fugitives in Adullam. 20s to late 20s. He was persona non grata. Description, this was by Achish. Behold, you see the man is mad. And who among your servants is so faithful as David? Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. I like that description as well. Lifestyle on the run, shepherd of the disfranchised, refused to kill the Lord's anointed. He was chased by Saul, protected his family at Moab, led the disenfranchised and the mighty men, renewed covenant with Jonathan, married Abigail for love, maybe, Ahinoam, I don't know. But to me, this is shepherding. Shepherding is different. Shepherding is not the same as leading men. He had all these disenfranchised people that were lost and needed a leader. He helped them become better people. That was shepherding. He got unused to luxury living, He learned to live off the fat of the land, learned about loyalty, learned about betrayal, learned how to inquire of the Lord before making decisions, and learned how to shepherd men. Kept the faith alive. Well, let's skip the quotes. Going on. David felt he had to live in exile. Let's move on to the development. Stays true to Israel in a foreign land, continued to rely on the Lord by inquiring of him, learns military strategy by raiding, learned diplomacy, learned how to lead uncooperative people in a military raid, and learned how to settle disputes among the army. That last part, he learned how to rule and how to be a ruler. You get put all those four things together, then pop, out comes a king. From 30 to 70, he was king of Judah, then king of Israel, then king of just Judah again, then king of all Israel again. He had a lot of major events that we've all studied. Here's our review. Next week, 1 Kings. Thank you very much. You're a little late, but we had a nice full class. Thank you very much. Don't forget next week, cookies.